The realm. Do you know what the realm is? It's the 1,000 blades of Aegon's enemies. A story we agree to tell each other over and over till we forget that it's a lie.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back for another Game of Thrones Season 8 update video. In this video, I want to discuss what Game of Thrones writers and showrunners David Benioff and DB Weiss said during a recent interview. This actually doesn't happen very often because Dan and Dave have been hiding ever since Game of Thrones ended over 4 years ago. Well, now that they're getting ready to release their new show on Netflix, the writers finally had to sit down for an interview where they revealed some of their thoughts about Game of Thrones' final season. As you all know, the ending of Game of Thrones was arguably one of the most divisive endings in the history of television. After it ended, there were millions of fans demanding HBO to remake the final season because of how much they hated what happened during those last 6 episodes. Well, ever since Game of Thrones ended, Dan and Dave have basically gone into hiding as a way to avoid the fans' backlash. They haven't read anything the fans have said about the show on social media. They don't sit down for interviews about the final season, and they've basically done everything to distance themselves from Game of Thrones. In this new interview, they do say something about the fans' reaction to the final season, as well as reveal what has happened whenever they do run into Game of Thrones fans since the show has ended. Now let's have a look at the new article so you're able to see for yourself. The author of this article, James Hibberd, who loves to hold Dan and Dave's hand, said, Game of Thrones ended, and David Benioff and Dan Weiss had to figure out what to do next. The writers had made the biggest series of the 21st century, and the most Emmy-winning drama of all time, and it was their very first show. HBO's Game of Thrones had a spectacular 8-season run, a global phenomenon that was reputationally marred by a 2019 final season that fans loudly considered disappointing. In the online space at least, Benioff and Weiss's obsessive day and night efforts to make one of the biggest shows ever was shrugged aside. I guess us fans aren't allowed to be angry with how Dan and Dave ended the show because of how hard they worked on it. I think it's fair to say we all recognized and even acknowledged all the hard work that went into the show after we all saw the Game of Thrones documentary. I'm sure they worked very hard to get Game of Thrones made, but that doesn't mean we can't highlight how awful their writing was either. He goes on to say, psychologists call this the peak end rule. How people feel about the end of something tends to color how they feel about all of it, and many fans felt raw about the end of Game of Thrones. Now I have to disagree with this as well. I still consider the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones the greatest television ever created. I have never seen anything as good as those first 4 seasons, and I'm not sure if I ever will again. So while I do dislike how Game of Thrones ended, it doesn't affect how I see the first half of the show. It's still some of the best writing and acting I've ever seen. In fact, even some of the scenes Dan and Dave wrote on their own in those early seasons are incredible. He goes on to say, after the final season, Dan and Dave, who never went on social media and only reluctantly gave interviews, even when Game of Thrones was at its height, did what they naturally do. They went almost entirely media silent. Now they're ready to talk about all of it. Well, let's just see how much they have to say because he makes it sound like they're ready to address everything. While I understand Dan and Dave not wanting to use social media, I think it's unacceptable to hide from any and all discussions about the show after it had such a divisive ending. They knew the fans would hate it, and that's exactly why they buried their heads in the sand. Let me ask all of you this. Do any of you actually think they would have stayed silent if everyone loved it? I don't. James does admit that Dan and Dave can sometimes come off as dismissive of the fans' feelings. Well, if you ask me, they're not only dismissive, but they avoid them altogether by shielding themselves from what the fans are actually saying. Now, he goes on to say, even if they secretly agree with some of the criticism for Game of Thrones, they feel it wouldn't benefit themselves, HBO, or the thousands of others who worked on the show by saying so. During the interview, David Benioff actually said, you always hope everyone's gonna love anything you do, and it would have been great if everyone loved it, but they didn't. You can get so bogged down in public opinion that you spend your whole day Googling things and trying to find fans who felt one way or the other. Now, Dan Weiss said, even super positive feedback makes you feel weird and teeth grindy and on edge. There's a drug quality to the feedback, and as soon as we went cold turkey, the last time I Googled myself was in 2013. The ambient stress level in our lives dropped by about 50% overnight. The Game of Thrones writers have even ran into some fans in real life since the show ended. These encounters, they say, have gone fine. There's an underlying decency when the fans acknowledge you as a person and vice versa, Dan Weiss said. There's always something that happens in the transition from human interaction to online that pushes things in a specifically aggro direction. When Dan and Dave ended Game of Thrones, many fans assumed they deliberately rushed the show to an early conclusion. They had actually said since Season 2 that they only wanted to make roughly 7 seasons, whether it was ultimately the best strategy or not. Now, I will say he's right about that. Dan and Dave always did say they wanted to make about 75 episodes. However, I still don't understand why they stuck to that number. They had to realize that wasn't enough to finish the story in a satisfactory way. George R. R. Martin even begged HBO to make more seasons. They went to Dan and Dave and offered them more money to make more episodes, but they still thought it was a great idea to end the show where they did. That I'll never understand. It doesn't matter if they always said they wanted to end it after 7 seasons. They had to see that the story was rushed in the end. He also says, another common assumption is that they left Game of Thrones to make more money elsewhere. One of their little noticed decisions goes against that idea. As the creators of Game of Thrones, Benioff and Weiss were contractually guaranteed producer credits on all future Game of Thrones spin-offs. That's basically a lifetime of franchise mailbox money for doing nothing on House of the Dragon for starters. And they say they turned it down. HBO was kinda confused, Benioff says. I remember their lawyers saying, but it's just money. We're just gonna give it to you. Dan Weiss added, I don't think there's such a thing as free money. For us, if our name is on it, especially that, while being completely detached and uninvolved, it felt like the strain that would come with the hands-off approach. With its success or failure or anything in between was not worth it. And no, they haven't seen House of the Dragon. Dan Weiss recently watched Game of Thrones with his family, but resists efforts to get him to reflect on the result. David Benioff hasn't watched a Game of Thrones episode since the finale. Yeah, I bet he doesn't want to see how insanely stupid it all feels by the end. As we all know, Jon Snow sat on the sidelines during the entire final season. Bran went from not wanting anything to suddenly wanting everything. Jaime Lannister was butchered, Dany was rushed, and the Night King and his army of the dead were swiftly defeated before they were even a real threat to Westeros. Now, this article said Dan and Dave were ready to address everything, but as always, they avoided getting into any of the real issues fans had with the show. Now they'll move on to their new Netflix series, and most likely fumble the ball at the goal line once again. Now, I will admit their new show does look very interesting, and I'm sure it will be good if they do a faithful adaptation. However, the author has already said he knows Dan and Dave will have to go in their own directions with his story. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see how they handle his novels. Let me know what you think about the interview down below. Are you satisfied with what they had to say? Does it make you feel any better about how Game of Thrones ended? Do any of you actually think Dan and Dave should be welcomed back into the fandom with open arms? Leave it all in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. As always, I want to thank all of you for watching another video. I hope you all have a great day. I will see you again very soon. Bye.